This video is sponsored by Squarespace.
What I love is how these things are supposed to be like diametrically opposed, and yet they're saying the same thing to me, which is just eat me, right? Eat me, eat me, eat me, eat me. Here in the United States, the term devil's food cake refers to a chocolate cake that is particularly dense, particularly rich, that is to say fatty and or sugary. But why, right? Well, I'm here to tell you that nobody has a definitive answer. I mean, people are going to be linking to authoritative sources here in the comments in 2 seconds to say, oh, there's all kinds of etymologies of devil's food cake, such as this one here in the Oxford Encyclopedia of Food and Drink. But if you actually read this, you can see that it's highly speculative. They don't claim to know for sure. Right, like all they're doing is taking a random, purely anecdotal sample of historical recipes that they have found and making educated guesses about where the terms came from based upon those primary sources, which is all I'm going to be doing for the duration of this video. And I don't think I'm going to come to conclusions that are terribly different from those of any other etymologist. I mean, I'm an amateur etymologist. If given the opportunity to believe an amateur etymologist versus a professional one, you should totally believe the professional one. But I don't think I'm going to be contradicting anybody here. I'm just going to be saying nobody knows for sure, and here are some potential explanations. What is pretty clear to me is that the name of this food is intertwined with some highly culturally contextual, preconceived notions about good and evil, which is kind of profound. Now, the etymologist note what we can see for ourselves here just in like Google Ngrams, which is that angel's food cake shows up in the language in the mid to late 19th century, a couple of decades before devil's food cake shows up. So first we had angel's food cake and then devil's food cake. So angel food cake shows up in the written record before devil's food cake does. What is angel food cake? Well, let's look at some historical recipes for this. All right, here's an old cookbook from 1905. There's a recipe here for a sponge cake, which is where you just take egg whites and you beat them with sugar to make a meringue, and then you fold that in with flour and some egg yolks and some other things, and there's your sponge cake. Well, here is an angel's food cake, and this is exactly the same as the sponge cake, except there is no egg yolk. So no egg yolks in this at all. You just take the egg whites, whip them with sugar until you have basically marshmallow fluff, fold in some flour with some flavorings and stuff, bake it. That is angel food cake. Why did they call it angel food cake? Well, it might have to do with its texture or its color. Like just above the angel's food recipe here, there's a recipe for a sunshine cake, which is exactly the same as the angel food, except it's got 4 egg yolks in it. 11 total eggs, because there's a lot of egg whites, but then just 4 egg yolks mixed in with that. So sunshine cake would have more egg yolks than the angel's food cake, but fewer egg yolks than the sponge cake, which uses all 10 whole eggs, right? Plenty other historical examples I can point to from around the turn of the 20th century where you see angel food cake and sunshine cake right next to each other, and they are virtually the same, except the sunshine cake has just a few egg yolks mixed into it. And what would happen if you had a few egg yolks in this batter? I think the cake would come out basically the same, except it would have a pale yellow hue to it, like a sunshine, which suggests that the naming is about the color. Furthermore, I think all of these historical recipes that I've come up with for angel food cake call for cream of tartar as the leavener. Cream of tartar is just an acidifier. It does not have an alkaline agent with it to create gas. By lowering the pH, making the pH of the batter more acidic, that will inhibit browning, which will make the resulting cake even more white. But also here's a recipe for sunshine cake that includes, yes, some of the egg yolks, yes, some cream of tartar as well, but in addition to the cream of tartar, look at this. Ammonia, 1/2 teaspoon of ammonia, or aqua ammonia will answer. I assume that means will suffice. Man, people used to use all kinds of crazy chemical leaveners back in the day. Why would you put ammonia in your cake batter? Well, to raise the pH, to counterbalance the acidifying effect of the cream of tartar and some of the other ingredients, like some of these have lemon juice in them. Why would you want to raise the pH? Raising the pH enhances browning, going to get you more golden, less pure white. So you want to have a higher pH for the sunshine cake, which is meant to evoke the color of a sunshine, and you want to have a lower pH for the angel's food cake, which is going to have the color of what exactly? Well, quite possibly the clouds in the sky where the angels dwell. So in Abrahamic theology, we think of angels as being these like heavenly servants, agents of a benevolent God. And here in the OED, we can see that angel's food, independent of cake, is centuries old as a pair of words, going back here to the 15th century, but always as a metaphor, right? So feeding our souls with the spiritual bread of life, that angel food, that heavenly manna of the Word of God. Scripture is being said or likened to food and calling it angel's food. And manna, the word with which angel's food is a synonym, is this word that pops up in the biblical book of Exodus. It's this food that God theoretically deposited on the ground for the starving Israelites to eat while they were out wandering in the wilderness. And if it's based on anything, one potential real thing it might have been was honeydew, that is to say the sweet secretions of certain insects like aphids. And of course there's examples from all kinds of cultures all over the world of food or drink that people thought was so good that it was fit for a god. So ambrosia, lots of foods have been referred to as ambrosia, which is this ancient Greek word for the food that ancient Greeks imagined the gods ate up on Mount Olympus, and now we use it to describe this weird mayonnaise fruit salad here in the United States. Angel's food, however, is also used for a fruit salad in South Africa, but that's a different evolution of the term. Here, why did they call this cake angel's food starting in the 19th century here in the United States? Well, it might have been that they thought that it was just so good that it counted as something that would be good enough for the gods, right? Or what they were looking at was the color, was that they made this very, very pure white cake, and that's a very loaded term here, we'll get back to it, pure white cake, that reminded them of clouds, right? Clouds are theoretically the abode of angels, or they might have considered it to be angelic because the color white is so tied in with concepts of like purity and goodness in white Christian culture. Now here it's important to acknowledge that what we're talking about is not limited to Western European ethnically white culture. The notion that whiteness is associated with life and with cleanliness. These are things that we see across lots of different cultures all over the world and across lots of different cultures with different colored skin tones, right? Because there's sort of semi-universal reasons for it, right? For one thing, humans are diurnal, right? We're awake during the day and then we sleep at night because our visual system is made for the day. At night, when it's dark, when it's black outside, we're more vulnerable because we can't see anything. So that's a reason for us to have evolved to be a little bit scared of dark-colored things. Also, association of whiteness with purity, that kind of makes sense, especially in a world before it was so easy to wash things. If you encountered something that was really, really gleaming white, that was really an indication that it was unusually clean in a world where it was hard to clean stuff. But there's counterexamples across all kinds of other traditional cultures of the world where white represents the unknown and death and things that people are frightened of, whereas black can represent goodness and wealth. And I mean, it gets all scrambled up when you look at the individual culture. It's culturally contextual, and therefore I think we do have to remind ourselves that 19th century United States was a really, really racist place, and that white people definitely had it in their heads that the color white signified purity, in part because it signified pure European lineage, unsullied by the darker-skinned people whom the Europeans had abducted and brought over to their country to press into forced labor. So when late 19th century Americans defined devil's food cake in relation to angel's food cake, and that's what the etymologists think happened, we had this thing called angel's food cake, and then people thought, it would be funny to have the opposite of angel's food cake. Oh, maybe it'd be devil's food cake, and it would be the opposite in every conceivable way, color-wise for sure. Well, we have to consider the possibility that if not explicitly, perhaps implicitly, part of what was going on there is that this is like racist Euro-American cooks baking their racist predispositions into the cake, as it were. Like angel's food, devil's food is a term that existed in English long before it was used to apply to cake. This is a poem from the mid-19th century by Thomas Kibble Hervey called The Devil's Progress, and here we see, "The devil slowly from the bank went musing to the mint, and each for tempting men to crime supplied him with a hint that many things at each he found that are a devil's food." Okay, he's comparing devil's food to money. Money is the devil's food. That is to say, a bad thing that the devil tempts you with. I know what that feels like. But devil's food, specifically to describe a cake, that shows up, it looks like maybe 10, 20 years after angel's food shows up in the language, right at the end of the 19th century, and didn't necessarily mean any chocolate cake. Like here's a farm journal from 1923, and it's describing angel food cake and gives several recipes for it, and then down here it gives a recipe for chocolate angel food cake. Like it's basically the same thing, except it has a little bit of sifted cocoa in it. There's a whole bunch of chocolate cake and devil's food cake recipes from the late 19th, early 20th centuries that all look basically the same, so here's a really useful source to try to figure out the difference. This is a 1905 cookbook. It's got a recipe for chocolate cake and then some recipes for devil's food cake, and the difference is just that the devil's food cakes have proportionally more sugar and more butter. They're richer. And here's a somewhat later source. It's from a farmer's bulletin in 1937, and therefore it's further away from the coinage of the term devil's food cake, and so we should trust it a little bit less, but wow, is it on the nose in terms of what we're looking for. It gives a master recipe for a rich cake, that is to say a cake with lots of butter in it, and it says specifically what you need to do to convert it to devil's food. Proportions as for chocolate cake with sour milk instead of sweet, and then 3/8 teaspoon soda, only 2 teaspoons baking powder. Sour milk, aka buttermilk, aka the milk that is left over from churning butter and then fermented to make it a little bit thick. So what this recipe writer is telling us is that what distinguishes regular rich chocolate cake from devil's food cake is buttermilk, sour milk. What does sour milk do to cake? Well, that sourness can actually come through in the taste if you don't balance it with some extra base, as they seem to be suggesting you do by adjusting their leavening in their ingredients. But the main thing that it will do is that it will make the cake kind of thicker and more moist. I think that's a couple of things going on there. One is that the buttermilk itself is thick and therefore adds to the viscosity of the batter. The other thing is that by lowering the pH, what you're doing is you're changing the way that the starches and the proteins also in the wheat will gel. And so you get more of a thick, moist, pudding-like, gel-like texture in the finished cake. It tastes dense and rich and moist if you use buttermilk, and that's what makes it devil's food as opposed to some other kind of chocolate cake. Now that said, you will find recipes online, both historical and modern, for devil's food cake that do not use soured milk. And conversely, you will find recipes for chocolate cake, not necessarily devil's food cake, that do use soured milk. However, the common thread that I have noticed anecdotally runs through all of the recipes for devil's food is that they will be dense and moist, either by use of soured milk or also maybe by use of solid baking chocolate as opposed to powder or cocoa, right? This, which has actual cocoa fat in it, is going to get you a bit more of a denser, more moist crumb. So all this has led more contemporary people like you and me to speculate that the reason they call it devil's food and they call this angel's food is that this has more calories, right? This has all that fat and sugar, making the crumb more dense and also making it, more likely to make you more dense. Actually less dense, because adipose tissue is comparatively less dense than, say, muscle. Now, I'm a little bit suspicious of that explanation because this notion that calories equal sin, that is a particularly modern, contemporary obsession, right? Back in the day when calories were more scarce, people were less morally hung up about consuming them. On the other hand, we do have a very, very ancient concept of gluttony that pervades, for example, Abrahamic theological thought, right? The idea that taking too much of anything is sinful. That is to say, it's not necessarily because it's like going to make you fat or whatever, but because you're just taking more than your fair share in the community of the thing that there is to eat. Or that specifically inherent in the concept of gluttony is the notion that it is wasteful consumption, right? Something into which there's gone a lot of work, a lot of community resources, and the payback is purely your pleasure as opposed to something more meaningful like your sustenance. So that could be one way in which this got named after the devil while this got named after the angel. Or, it could just be racism. But there's also this centuries-old word in English, deviled. Deviled as in deviled eggs, deviled all kinds of food. Generally refers to highly flavored or spiced foods. And one potential etymology there is that maybe people just associated intensely flavored foods with the pleasures of the body, and therefore something that appealed to your more animal instincts, your less civilized instincts. Ooh, dangerous, right? But what the OED looks at for the etymology of deviled is this Hellenistic Greek word describing sort of demonic possession. So in that sense, deviled food may actually just be food that has the spirit inside it, right? The wheat or whatever the main nutrition providing ingredient in there, that's the the vessel, right? But the spirit that's inside of it is the tastiness, the seasoning that you put in there. In the case of this cake, it's the chocolate. But we have no way of knowing if devil's food cake was named after other deviled foods. Just looking at the evidence as I have, I suppose I'm leaning personally more toward the explanation that it was simply defined in opposition to a pre-existing food, which was the angel cake. And while color may be the most obvious difference between these two, I want us to consider texture as well. All of the things that make angel food cake different from other kinds of sponge cakes, leaving out the egg yolks, not using butter, that kind of stuff, not only do they affect color, they also affect texture. If you put some egg yolks in here to make it a sunrise cake or whatever they were calling it before, not only would that make this look a little bit yellow, it would also make the resulting cake denser, heavier, right? And what do light things do? They float. They're more buoyant, right? They float up into the air like a nice light puffy cloud, whereas heavy things get dragged down, down, down to the core by their weight. And especially within the context of like Abrahamic religions where we associate heavenly things with up high and hellish things with down low, well, that seems like another reason to associate a dense cake with the devil and a light cake with the opposite of the devil. Of course, in my belief system, there's nothing remotely sinful or devilish about chocolate cake. In fact, I would consider devil's food to be manna from heaven, much like Squarespace, sponsor of this video. You're going to see how easy it is to make a website from scratch now using Squarespace's design intelligence. Devil cake. I want my brand personality to be playful. Gonna need an intro, a product section, and about at the very least. Choose a color palette. That looks like it could be chocolatey. It's a chocolatey font, I'll tell you that. And then it just builds the whole thing for you. Anything they put in that I need to change, I just double click on it and edit, replace that photo. But of course you can use stock art. They've got a huge stock photo library you can use. Type in my own text, ain't no sin about it. That's right. Now, if I want to sell people my cakes over the internet, I can just add a commerce block here and we'll do Squarespace payments. Whether you're taking like ACH debit or Apple Pay, Afterpay, ClearPay in the UK, it's all here. And of course, whether it's mobile or desktop, you can just grab the elements and move them around on the grid using Fluid Engine. You can do all of that for free right now at squarespace.com. But when it's time to pay for something, like publishing your site and making it live and having Squarespace host it for you, or when it comes to registering a custom domain, think of your old buddy Goose. Use my code Ragusia at checkout, or you can just go to squarespace.com/Ragusia. Save 10% on publishing your first website or registering a domain name. Thank you, Squarespace. And thank you, cake. I love both of these kinds of cake, even if their naming history may be at least somewhat on some subconscious level intertwined with sort of ugly racial politics in the United States. I still think there's no reason to hate on angel food cake. It's delicious stuff. And indeed, if someone in your family dies, and if you have a friend who's African American, odds are they're going to come over to your house with an angel food cake because that's just part of that culture. So there's no reason to dislike angel food cake. I'm going to go eat this and this.